I let a good man walk away, and I have regretted it for more than 20 years. I am 85 years old, and there is one thing I know now that I wish, with everything in me, that I had known at 61. I thought I was being wise, but I was only being afraid. So sit with me for a little while. I have a chair by the window that gets the morning light just right, and I have more than 8 decades of quiet observations to share with you. I was married for 26 years to a man who was an accountant, a quiet, steady man who liked the news after dinner and always remembered to put the bins out. He wasn't the kind of man who brought flowers for no reason, but he was reliable, and reliability, when you're young and busy raising 3 children, feels like everything. It feels like the whole foundation of your life. He passed in 1997, a heart attack, very sudden. The children were grown by then, and in one ordinary Thursday afternoon, the house went from full to completely still. The world simply continued, as it always does, and I stood in the middle of it, not quite knowing how to move. I was 54 years old. Now, 54 does not sound old to me now, but back then, standing in that kitchen, looking at 2 coffee cups when I only needed 1, it felt ancient. It felt like the story was over. And that is where I made the first of my quiet mistakes. I decided, without anyone telling me to, that this was simply how the rest of it would go, that I had had my chapter, and now it was time to be the grandmother in the background, smiling warmly at everyone else living their lives. For years, that is exactly what I did. My daughter used to say, "Mum, you should get out more," and I would wave her off the way you wave off a fly on a summer afternoon. Gentle but definite. I told her I was perfectly content. I had my garden and my books and my Thursday morning coffee with a dear friend who had also been widowed, who understood the particular rhythm of a quiet life, and I was content. I want to be honest about that. There is a real pleasure in a life that belongs entirely to yourself, in sleeping in the middle of the bed, in watching whatever you like on a Sunday evening without negotiating. Those years were not empty. They were mine, and there is a certain dignity in that. But there was something underneath the contentment that I did not look at too closely, like a room in the house where the door is always slightly closed, and you learn, after a while, to simply walk past it without turning your head. There was one man who came into my life after 60, and I pushed him away. He was a retired school teacher, a friend of my neighbor's husband. He came to a small dinner party she had in November, one of those evenings where you go mostly because you feel you ought to, because you have run out of polite excuses, and you find yourself pleasantly, genuinely surprised. He sat across from me at the table and leaned forward slightly. "What are you reading?" he asked. Not as a polite question, the way people do at dinners when they are simply filling silence, with actual curiosity. His eyes were steady and waiting. He wanted the real answer. "Birds," I said, "the migratory patterns of birds." He raised his eyebrows slightly, and then he smiled. "I've always wanted to understand birds better, never had the patience for it." He tilted his head. I admire patience in people who have it. I thought about that comment for 3 days afterward. I turned it over while I was in the garden, while I was washing up, while I lay awake listening to the rain. It was such a small thing to say, but something in it had landed. He called the following week. My neighbour had passed along my number, and I won't pretend I hadn't half hoped she would. We had tea, then we had tea again. Then, one Sunday in December, we walked along the canal when the light was low and golden, and the whole world seemed to be made of amber. He pointed out a grey heron standing perfectly still at the water's edge. We both stopped without a word and watched it together. When it finally lifted and flew, slow and enormous against the pale sky, he said quietly, "There it is. There's the patience." I remember thinking on the walk home that I had not felt that easy with another person in a very long time. He was kind. He was interesting. He had opinions about things and was not afraid to share them, but he listened just as readily as he spoke. He laughed at the right moments and was quiet at the right moments, which is rarer than people realize and worth more than most people know. And then one evening the phone rang. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the garden go dark. The last of the light was leaving the sky in slow bands of grey and rose. I could see his name on the phone screen, glowing on the counter beside me. And I stood there. I stood there and I let it ring. Not because anything had gone wrong, not because he had done or said a single thing to make me uncomfortable, but because something in me had grown frightened, frightened of change, frightened of opening that door I had kept so carefully closed, frightened, if I am truly honest, of losing someone again, of allowing myself to care about someone and then one day having them taken away. I had already survived that once, and so I decided, standing at that window, that it was safer not to try. I let it ring, and then I let it ring again the next evening, and the one after that. I told him I had been busy, and busy turned into distance, and distance turned into silence, and then it was simply over before it had ever really begun. He moved away 2 years later. To be closer to his daughter, I heard through my neighbour. He seemed well, she said, happy enough. He had joined a walking group, apparently. He was getting on fine. I nodded and said I was glad. And I was, mostly. But there was that closed door again. And this time I knew, with a certainty that settled in my chest like something heavy, that I had closed it myself. If you are finding this story familiar, if you have been walking past a closed door of your own, I want you to stay with me a little longer. If this resonates with you, I want you to know that this channel is a place where these quiet conversations happen all the time. People sharing honestly what they have learned in the slower years. If that means something to you, I would be so glad if you subscribed. Connection, as I am slowly learning, is never a small thing. Now, where was I? The years after he moved away were good years in many ways. My grandchildren were growing up. My garden was the best it had ever been. I travelled once to Portugal with my daughter, and I stood on a cliff above the Atlantic and felt genuinely like the world was enormous and I was still somehow part of it. But in those same years, a quiet regret began to settle in, not dramatically, not the way you read about in stories, where someone weeps at the window. It was quieter than that, more like a small stone in your shoe that you keep forgetting is there and then suddenly feel again with every step. I would be at a family dinner and watch my son-in-law pour my daughter a glass of wine without her asking, because after 20 years he simply knew, and I would feel something small shift in my chest. Not jealousy, closer to longing, the recognition of what it is to be known by someone over a long stretch of time. The realization came slowly and only fully arrived when I was perhaps 76 or 77, sitting in this same chair by this same window, watching a pair of birds building a nest in the hedge across the way. I had been so afraid of disruption that I had protected myself from joy. That sounds simple when I say it like that, but it did not feel simple at 61. It felt like wisdom. It felt like self-preservation, like knowing myself and being sensible about what I had already been through. But wisdom and fear can wear the same coat sometimes, and I had not been wise. I had been afraid. And there is an important difference between the two, even when they feel identical from the inside. I am not telling you that he was the love of my life, or that things would have been perfect, or that it would have lasted. I have lived long enough to know that no one can promise you those things. Relationships between real people who have already lived whole lives are complicated. They require patience and compromise, and the willingness to make space for another person's history. They are not simple. What I am telling you is this: I would rather have tried. I would rather have walked through that door and found out what was on the other side, even if it was simply a room that didn't quite fit, than to have spent the following 20 years wondering. Wondering is a very particular kind of ache. It does not ease with time the way other griefs do. If anything, it settles in more deeply, becomes part of the furniture, becomes the thing you live around. I have a friend who is 81 years old. She met a man when she was 68, after more than 2 decades on her own. She was terrified. She told me she had lain awake the entire night before their first dinner, going through every reason it would not work. She almost cancelled. She almost talked herself out of it entirely. She is still with him today, 13 years later. They bicker about the television volume and argue about which route to take to the supermarket. They also take slow walks in the evenings and hold hands while they do it. She told me once she had been alone so long she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone notice when she came into the room. She is one of the most contented people I know. I am not saying this to make you feel you have failed if you are alone and at peace with it. Genuine peace is one of the finest things a person can arrive at, and I would never want to disturb it. Some people truly thrive in solitude, and that is not a consolation prize. That is a real and valid life. But I am saying this for the people who, like me, are walking past a closed door. The ones who have convinced themselves it is too late, or too complicated, or that they are too set in their ways to let anyone in. The ones who are telling themselves they are being sensible, when really, quietly, underneath, they are only being afraid. It is not too late. Not at 60, not at 65, not at 70. I have seen it happen at 72. The heart does not have an expiry date, even when we try very hard to give it one. The years do not slow down the way you expect them to. You think at 50 that you have time to circle back around to things, and then you are 65, and then 70, and then you are me, sitting here with my long view of a life that has held both full rooms and quiet ones, and you realize that the circling took longer than the living. Give the things that matter a chance, not recklessly, not without thought, but with the courage that a long life actually earns you. You have survived things. You have rebuilt yourself more than once. You are not fragile. You are experienced. And experienced is a very different thing from finished. The small joys matter too. My granddaughter brought me a bunch of yellow tulips last month, and I put them in the blue jug on the windowsill. And every morning this week I have woken up and looked at them and felt something warm and uncomplicated move through me. The morning light matters. The phone call from a voice you love matters. But so does allowing someone to know you, to see the version of you that exists now, not the one from decades ago, but this one, the one who has earned every grey hair, and every quiet morning, and every hard-won perspective. I waited too long, not because I was content, but because I was afraid that contentment would not survive change. And maybe I was right. Maybe it would have changed. But I think what might have grown in its place could have been something richer. If you have been waiting too, I want you to hear this from someone who has walked all the way to the other end of this road and turned around to look back. Open the door while you still can. Don't wait so long that wandering becomes your only companion. If this story felt familiar, subscribe. Leave a comment telling me something true about your life. I read every single one, and they matter to me more than I can say. You remind me that none of us is as alone in this as we sometimes feel. You are not too old. You are not too late. I wish someone had told me that on some quiet Tuesday morning when I was standing in my kitchen with 2 cups and only needed one. Now go and drink your tea while it is still warm.